Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. Today is January 12th, 2021, and this is our first lecture of the new year. I'm Steve Shields. I'm president of Royal Asiatic Society, Korea. On behalf of the officers and the council, I welcome you to lecture number 1433. The Royal Asiatic Society traces its beginnings to India in the late 1700s and was formally chartered in London in 1824 by King George IV. The Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain and Ireland granted a charter to the Korea branch in 1900, which was the fourth year of the Gwangmu Emperor of Korea. RAS Korea expresses sincere thanks to our generous sponsor, Asia Development Foundation, for their continuing support. We also thank our members who have paid their annual dues. Your dues provide essential primary funding for RAS Korea, and we appreciate your support. If you are not a member, we request a one-time admission of 10,000 won or $10. Full-time students can pay 5,000 won or $5. Please refer to the donation screen, which is somewhere in your window. There it is, for information about PayPal and bank transfer information. This information will also be posted in the chat box. Having said that, we would rather you join us as a member. It only takes a few minutes to sign up. Membership gives you unlimited access to our online events. Members receive discounts on RAS books, and you will also receive our annual journal, Transactions. See our website at raskb.com for details, and I'll post a link in the chat box as well. We are delighted tonight to have Professor Michael J. Seth from James Madison University in the United States. Michael noted that I have the wrong book on my introductory screen. We should have his History of North Korea, but it was the concise history that introduced me to Michael's work. And I found his, should we call it an overview of the several thousand years of Korean history to be quite interesting and brought up a lot of new thoughts for me. We appreciate his willingness to join us at such an early hour. After the lecture, there will be time for questions. Now, if you will please be sure to mute your mics, we will proceed with Michael's presentation. Michael, I'll stop my share, which means you should be able to go to the share screen icon and share your screen, hopefully. There we go.
And
there we go.
Okay, so everybody sees this? This is
Yep.
coming, okay.
You can see it.
Okay, good. Yeah, this is the book that I was referring to that on North Korea. I should point out, by the way, that it is the best English language history of North Korea available. I can say that with great confidence because it is the only history of North Korea in English. And
It works.
I should be, first of all, let me begin by saying thank you for inviting me to the Royal Asiatic Society. I'm not unfamiliar with it because when I lived in Seoul in the early 1980s, I would occasionally attend a meeting of it in downtown Seoul. And I enjoyed, it was a good introduction for me because when I came to Korea, I was not a Korean specialist. I was not actually an Asian specialist. Oddly enough, I came to Korea from Africa, where I worked for a number of years. And so it was a good introduction to me to the culture and history of the country that I had taken temporarily a job in. And so I do have fond memories of the Royal Asiatic Society, although I admit it's been probably close to 40 years since I attended a meeting of it. So the talk today is on really a kind of an overall view of North Korea's history with the idea of explaining it, interpreting it as a failed revolution. That's just one way of thinking about it. And I'm not sure the audience, how much familiarity you have with the topic. I know that we have some people who are very knowledgeable and maybe some that are less so. So please excuse me if I cover anything that seems too basic, but I just like to point out that North Korean regime has its roots in the Korean nationalist movement that occurred during Japanese colonial rule. And my point here really is to kind of normalize North Korea, is seeing it as growing out of what in some ways was a typical anti-imperialist, anti-colonial independence movement. And also pointing out that although the nationalist movement during the Japanese colonial rule was divided ideologically and geographically, there was one common thread, and that was that almost all Korean nationalists, from conservatives to communists, shared the same fundamental goal of creating a modern Korea free from foreign control that would be prosperous and strong enough to defend its autonomy, as well as to take its place in the world of progressive modern nations. And I point that out because that was the goal of the North Korean regime, and it remained the goal for many decades. So,
Michael?
Yeah.
Can you move your PowerPoint to the slide mode rather than the mode that we're seeing?
Oh, you can't see it too well?
No, we're seeing the left-hand column of all the slides, and so it shrinks the ability for us to see your main slide.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Okay,
Sorry.
let me see. Okay, let me see what I can do here.
You go up to slideshow.
Yeah, slideshow. That's a new slide.
Yeah.
Slideshow. Oh,
That's
yeah, right. Yeah, I see
right
it.
about in the middle there.
But it's right. Yeah, I see it.
Yeah.
Or just hit F5.
Or F5. Thanks.
F5. Okay. Which I've done.
Okay, that didn't.
Does that look better?
Click on from current slide. It's
From
your
current
second
slide.
icon.
Okay, thank you. Oh, now
Yes.
it's coming across better.
There we go. Yeah. Thanks very much. Sorry to interrupt.
No, not at all. I'm sorry that I didn't have it lined up. Okay. And now I have, okay. So North Korean regime under Kim Il-sung, who consolidated power in the late 40s and early 50s, had the goals were a united Korean people. He wanted to unify the state. I think somehow a couple of slides got missed, but I think it doesn't really matter too much. And he wanted a state that would be free from outside control, militarily strong. And prosperous, and be able to take its place in the progressive societies in the world. In other words, he wanted to complete the nationalist project, and he never really wavered from this basic goal of unifying the country after its division and making Korea a state that would be as autonomous as possible from outside control. And then that would mean being a state that was both strong and prosperous and a progressive state that could be proudly take its place in the world. And I would point out that when I was reading these speeches and propaganda material, I just noticed this was such a consistent theme. And it was clear for me that the leaders of North Korea in the late 40s, in the 1950s, in the 1960s, were really concerned not just by unifying the country, but they thought of themselves, the place of their country in the world. That is, they wanted them to be seen by the world, the larger global community, as a modern progressive example, and even an example society state. Well, then the Korean War, of course, was an attempt at reunification that failed. And this is probably, again, well known to most of people here. But I just want to point out that North Korea's failure to unify the country in 1950, it was a plan that was fairly reasonable. It was a plan that was based on the fact that the U.S. commitment to defense of South Korea was rather ambiguous, ambivalent at the most. The U.S. had cut funding, aid funding. Congress had cut aid funding, the U.S. to South Korea. The U.S. had pulled out its troops and only had a 500-man military advisory commission. And that the South Korean military was much weaker than the North Korean military and did not have the artillery and tanks and planes that North Korea had. And in addition, the country seemed rather unstable. There was widespread discontent, insurrection. Therefore, it seemed likely that an invasion would be fairly easy. I think that Kim Il-sung, North Korean leadership, felt and managed to convince the Soviet and Chinese leadership that the war could be won in a number of days and the country would be unified. But of course, as we all know, it didn't, the plan did not work, and it did not work for a number of reasons. The main reason was the unexpectedly rapid intervention of the United States, but also after initial successes, the South Korean military did not collapse as quickly as it was expected to. And a popular uprising in support for the North Koreans in South Korea did not materialize. But the war, the two things about the war is, one, that it didn't change anything. It left the country divided. I always say that North Korea came close to being a war in which everyone lost. No one really succeeded in achieving its ultimate objectives. But for the second thing about it was that the war was not over. Not only was there a ceasefire, but it was not over in the minds of the North Korean leadership. They had lost a battle, but not the war, which there was a great deal of belief and confidence among the North Korean leadership that it was the inevitable victory and reunification of the country might take place longer than they thought, but it would take place. Kim Il-sung's North Korea as foreign policy was pretty clear and pretty consistent. It had two basic elements to it. One was to achieve autonomy. North Korea was, in its inception in 1948, a Soviet client state. Even the Constitution of Democratic People's Republic of Korea was actually written by the Soviets. It was written in Russian and then translated into Korean and given to Korea. Before 1950, North Korea had to consult with Moscow on all matters. In fact, Moscow would actually tell North Korean government which countries it could establish diplomatic relations with and which it could not. The Soviet ambassador to North Korea was as much of a proconsul as he was an ambassador. And But the Korean War gave space that when the Chinese intervened and took over the military operation of the war during the Korean War, Moscow's control over the North Korean regime weakened. And after 1953, the aid of the Soviet Union, its Eastern European allies, and China was very important for the reconstruction of the country following the war. But policies of the Kim Il-sung and the North Korean regime were pretty consistent, and that was to free itself from as much control and influence by Moscow or even by Beijing as possible, and to achieve as much autonomy. The second part was reunification, and that was a central preoccupation. And Kim Il-sung gradually articulated a threefold strategy for reunification. And I want to point out that in February 1964, he gave a speech and saying, this is our strategy. And it outlines in fairly amount of detail what the strategy for reunification was. And what I'd like to point out about it is that for the next 30 years of his rule, from 1964 to 1990s, North Korea never deviated from this strategy. It was very consistent. In fact, one of the things that I found out about North Korea is if you wanted to find out what they were really planning to do, just listen to the speeches. They usually made it clear what the plans of the government the regime were. But the threefold strategy was first to strengthen the North, to make North Korea militarily and economically strong enough so that that it could serve two purposes. One would be so it would be militarily able to invade and take over South Korea when the opportunity came, but also a military, at least an industrial strong North Korea would serve as a model for the South Koreans. It would be a model of a proud, independent, progressive Korea, as opposed to the impoverished, unstable American client state or puppet state that South Koreans lived in. So the strengthening of the North served those two purposes. The second part of the strategy was to encourage revolutionary forces in the South. And that was, of course, won by demonstrating the successful model of North Korea by supporting pro-Pyongyang elements in the RK whenever possible. And as many of you may know, there were many South Koreans, intellectuals, students, dissidents, that were sympathetic to the North. And third was to get the US out of Korea. And doing this would be through strengthening the international revolutionary forces, which essentially was to gain international support and put pressure on the United States to withdraw its forces from South Korea, because Kim Il-sung was very much a realist and knew that they could not reunify the country as long as American forces were there and committed to its defense. And this third strategy involved a lot of things, and involved weakening the US position in Asia whenever possible. For instance, the support of Vietnam, North Vietnam during the Vietnam War would be one of those, but also gaining support from the international community and the United Nations to pass resolutions that would call for the withdrawal of foreign forces. And I should point out that North Korea became quite successful at the last point. They managed to, especially from the mid-70s, gain enough support from the non-aligned movement and the Third World that the General Assembly almost annually passed resolutions calling for the withdrawal of all foreign forces in the Korean Peninsula, which of course meant the United States. That, of course, proving that North Korea was the real progressive Korea and being prepared for unification through economic progress and military strength. These pictures are from more recent years, a postage stamp and a military parade. But I took something from recent years to point out how this part of North Korea's narrative, as its purpose, that it told its people, it told itself, I think, for a long time, how important and central it really was, that the country had to be this prosperous and strong model for all Koreans, that all Koreans would see the Democratic People's Republic of Korea as the true embodiment of the Korean national spirit and the inheritor of the pre-colonial Korean nation state. And at this point, I'd also mention that North Korea was never a Soviet clone, that in fact it modeled itself initially as on Stalinist Russia, but it was strongly influenced by Maoist ideas, by pre-war imperial Japan's mystical nationalism, and by Confucian cult of the family. One of the fascinating things about North Korea, making it so different from other communist regimes, was the family. It was even enshrined in the 1972 Constitution, which states that the family is the basic unit of society. It's the basic unit of the socialist state. And the cult of the family, of course, was very convenient when North Korea leader Kim Il-sung decided to keep the leadership in his family. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but in the 1960s, he began to promote his younger brother as his successor. And then in the 70s, he switched to his eldest son as his successor, Kim Jong-il. But there was much more than that. North Korea, from the late 50s, achieved quite a bit of political autonomy. And it was able to do this in part by the Sino-Soviet split. That is, it was able to establish friendly relationships with both countries. The skill by which North Korea did this should be pointed out by the fact that in 1961, it signed a formal military alliance with Moscow, and Moscow was committed to the protection of North Korea. And the very next day, it signed almost an identical treaty with China. Having achieved increasingly by the 60s political autonomy, it was now achieving ideological autonomy. And increasingly by the 1960s, North Korea was moving in its own direction. One of this was the creation of its own ideology. I have no doubt that North Korea was being influenced by Maoism. It's kind of ironic. This is what I've noticed, is that Kim Il-sung personally thought the Chinese Cultural Revolution, which began in 1966, was, as he stated told the Russians, was pure idiocy, and even made fun about Mao Zedong being senile. But at the same time, he adopted many elements of it. And one is that by the 1960s, especially in the late 1960s, he sought to promote himself not only as a great leader, but a great thinker. And his ideology, Kim Il-sungism, the core of it was Juche thought. And Juche thought, people spend a lot of time trying to determine what Juche thought is. I think it's has rather vacuous content myself, and it really doesn't matter what it says. What's more important is that North Korea had its own thought, and it made North Korea ideologically independent, autonomous, a proud Korean ideology. It was often defined as applying socialism to the conditions of Korea. It was enshrined in the 1972 Constitution as the foundation of the state. And I should point out that after 1972, references to Marxism, Leninism, or even communism became increasingly rare. The ideology was Juche thought. North Korea continued to call itself socialist, but rarely called itself Marxist-Leninist. It had its own ideology. It was an ideology that not only was Korean, but in many ways superseded Marxist-Leninism and brought both the Korean nation and humankind to a new plane of thought. This is a direct quotation from one of the common propaganda lines. So if you look at North Korea, it achieved, the North Korean regime was in many ways a successful revolution. It created an independent autonomous state. The leadership had more freedom of action than the South Korean government had at that time, or many post-colonial states, which were in a greater position of economic or cultural dependency on their former colonial rulers. And it made great economic progress. It's really impressive, the progress that North Korea made in the first 20 or so years after the Korean War. But in the early 1970s, it was the most industrialized and urbanized country in Asia after Japan. Now, some of this industrialization was simply rebuilding some of the infrastructure that the Japanese had built during colonial times, because during colonial rule, most of the Japanese investment in industry was in the North. The North had access to hydroelectric energy, cheap energy, and as well as iron and coal and some of the other basic minerals. And so most of the industrial investment was in the North. So North Korea did inherit a lot of Japanese industrial plant, but it also expanded upon these. And what was interesting is by the early 1970s, 2/3 of the population of North Korea lived in cities. And just to give you an idea how urbanized it had become by the 70s, is that China didn't reach that same level until 2010. And only Japan was more urbanized. And as far as industrial infrastructure, again, it had more industrial infrastructure than any other Asian country, for the size of the country. And also made great advances in education and health. It virtually wiped out the literacy rate was approaching 100%. It's really hard to know. You always have to, North Korea ceased publishing accurate statistics from the early 60s, but nonetheless, every indication is that literacy rates were very high. And by the 70s, there was 11 years of compulsory schooling, which was higher than, again, almost any country in Asia. And healthcare may be rudimentary, but not bad. I mean, even if we view them with some skepticism, infant mortality rates, longevity in North Korea were very high by the level of developing countries. So initially, North Korea was pretty successful in achieving its goals. Politically, it could look down on South Korea as a country that was less successful in achieving political autonomy, that it was still basically not only client state, but you could say South Korea independence was constrained by the American presence in the way that the Soviet Union or China did not have that kind of influence, and were not able to impose similar constraints in North Korea. And it's economically outpaced South Korea in its development throughout the 1950s and 60s, but that was no longer true in the 1970s. But I wanted to point out, and I mentioned this in the book I wrote, because when I was reading the literature, when I was reading the reports on the Western press about from North Korea, I was really surprised by the fact that Western journalists, and I read journalists, American journalists, Canadian journalists, they were French, Dutch, who had visited North Korea in the early 70s. And I should point here that in the early 1970s, North Korea opened itself up just a little crack and allowed more journalists. Like Harrison Salisbury from the New York Times, for instance, was allowed to tour the country. And the comments were fairly favorable. And not only that, they were favorable in contrast to South Korea, to many Westerners, even to Harrison Salisbury, later an editor of the New York Times and a kind of an Asian hand, said, contrasted to the orderly, the cleanliness, to the chaos and dirt of Seoul. He pointed out that you didn't see any kids selling gum on the street, and everybody looked well clothed and decently fed, and how neat and villages. People were surprised at how much of the agriculture was mechanized in the 1970s. And North Korea manufactured its own tractors and its own farm equipment. Its first tractor was produced, I think, in 1957, went into production. And not only that, but North Korea had, especially in the 70s, broken out of its isolation and established diplomatic relations with more than 100 countries. It had more diplomatic representation than South Korea did. It had more recognition. It was actually a member of more international organizations than South Korea was. In 1975, it had gained membership into the non-aligned movement. And we could see that from about the mid-70s, when the UN consistently passed pro-North Korean resolutions. The General Assembly did. Of course, those resolutions would be vetoed in the Security Council. So if you look at it, all three, this goal of political and economic and cultural autonomy was largely successful. And its three-pronged strategy for reunification also seemed to be going somewhat well. And then things went wrong. And the turning point that I like to mention is at the Sixth Party Congress in 1980. By then, it's pretty obvious the signs that North Korea's revolution was not going to achieve its goals were already there, but they were not yet obvious. And Kim Il-sung gave a lengthy speech, I think it was 2 or 3 hours long, very long speech, in which he summarized all the achievements of the regime, all the goals, how they've been met, and said the situation looked really, really good. And if you remember, 1980 was a very, very bad year in South Korea. South Korea saw, had assassination of Park Chung-hee. There was the Gwangju incident. There were many students and radicals. They were echoing pro-North Korean propaganda. The country's economy was in shambles. Its GDP shrank by 6% in 1980. Foreigners were speculating that South Korea's economic boom had probably come to its end, and the country seemed to be entering a period of greater instability. And of course, this was also the Carter administration, and Jimmy Carter himself was really committed to pulling US forces out of South Korea. So if you looked at the situation in 1980, it looked pretty good. Of course, underneath that, we see that by 1980, South Korea had already far surpassed North Korea in economic development. The GDP per capita was probably already double that of the North. The standard of living was going up. South Koreans were actually, may not have looked as orderly as the North, but they were probably better fed and increasingly better educated and healthy. And South Korea was entering a very successful effort to enter global markets with its goods, whereas nobody, not even the communist allies, wanted North Korea's shoddy manufactured goods. And it secretly, to an extent that was not fully understood by the outside world at that time, was heavily dependent on Soviet aid, and especially the subsidies of oil. It had increasingly relied on oil as the most important source of its energy, and it imported almost all of that from the Soviet Union at friendship prices, which essentially meant that it got close to free oil, petroleum. So there are many ways it was economically dependent, but that was not on the Soviet Union, but that was not so obvious. And then all kinds of things went really bad after 1980. One was the rise of South Korea. South Korea burst out of the shadow of the United States in the early 1980s. A turning point was the awarding in 1981 of the Olympics, but also the South Korean government, early 80s, made a concerted effort to gain recognition, international recognition, and a very successful one. I remember that myself. I was in South Korea in the early 80s, and I would meet these people from Turkey and Colombia and Sri Lanka. They were in programs, and they were being shown South Korea as a economic success story. And the ones I met were all very impressed, right? And in the early 80s, you really see this shift where countries around the world began to realize, well, South Korea was very successful and maybe a good model for other developing countries. And from about 1982, North Korea could no longer get a pro-Pyongyang resolution through the General Assembly. From about 1982, they consistently failed. Its former allies in the Third World would not vote for a North Korean resolution. And I think that was the success of South Korean diplomacy. It was very successful in the early 80s in turning many of the developing countries against North Korea. So, and of course, you had the Reagan administration in the 80s and a reaffirming affirmation of American commitment to the defense. And in the 1980s, the economy of North Korea was stagnating. And it really needed foreign exchange, import of foreign capital of goods. It needed an influx to revive its economy. It was not able to do that. It did make an attempt to borrow some money from the international market, but quickly defaulted on its loans. South Korea, of course, was booming in the 80s. There was a period of double-digit growth for a while. The GDP was growing at 12%. South Korea had the fastest economic growth rate of any country in the world. So it was increasingly behind. And then, of course, was the fall of the Soviet Union and the reforms, economic reforms in China, both which were very threatening to the regime. And then came the economic contraction that began around 1990. The most shocking thing was when in 1990, the Gorbachev regime simply said that they were no longer giving economic aid, that North Korea, if they wanted to import things from Soviet Union, they had to pay in hard currency, which North Korea did not have. And by the early 90s, the economy was in severe contraction and leading to the Great Famine. The famine actually began, excuse me, around 1991, but by 1996 it got so bad that that North Korea had to call for international help. And what you would see is by the 1990s, at some point, North Korea foreign policy shifted from unification to simply survival. And I would argue, well, North Korea has never abandoned its original goals in theory. Its policy from the early or mid 90s to the present has basically been just to survive. So if you think of, that's where I get to the point of being a failed revolution. If you think of what North Korea's revolutionary goals were, you could say that it achieved a certain amount of, it certainly has achieved a great degree of political autonomy, but not necessarily economic autonomy. In fact, one could argue that even this is compromised by its dependence on China, because without China's economic lifeline, it probably would not survive at all, the regime. So it is somewhat economically dependent on China. Its goal to reunify the country certainly has failed. And its goal to be seen by the people of South Korea as the true inheritor of the Korean spirit and the successful progressive regime, that has failed. And its goal to be a prosperous state certainly has failed. It's now one of the poorest countries in Asia. And its goal to achieve recognition around the world as a shining example of development and join the ranks of the progressive nations has failed completely. It is basically an international pariah. That is, so that's why I would say that it's a failed revolution. I think I'll just end it there. The question, and I'm sure people have some questions on this, and this is just one way of looking at North Korea history.
Oh, thank you.
We have time for questions?
Yes, we do. Folks, if you will look at the bottom of your Zoom window, there's an icon labeled participants. Click on that icon and a box with everyone's name should pop up. At the bottom of that box is a function called raise hand. Please use that to ask questions. Smartphones are configured a bit differently. I note on my iPhone, I must go to a more menu at the bottom. If your video is disabled or not available, please ask a question in the chat box. I'll try to get around to those as best I can. So we will open it for questions. Michael, there's a question right off the bat here about your one of your books on education in South Korea has been translated.
Oh, Education Fever, yes.
Education Fever. It's been published in Korean. Are you going to have your North Korea history translated into Korean?
Well, I don't, probably not. It'd be, in the case of the Education Fever, that wasn't translated until what, 15 years after it came out in English. It had already been translated in other languages. It was translated in Spanish before it was translated in Korean. And those things are, were really a matter of, you know, does a publisher want to publish? So, yeah. You know, if some Korean publisher is interested in the book, but it is funny that that Education Fever seemed to have, you know, it was published in full in Spanish, and excerpts of it were published in German and French before it was published in Korean.
Interesting. A question in the chat box from Algie Lacey. From when and why did Kim Il-sung see the need for a mythical personality cult? There were never statues of Park Chung-hee, for example.
Well, that's a good question. And a lot of people have tried to look at the origins of this cult. For one thing, the cult itself was invented by the Soviets. When in the late 40s, when the Soviet Union set up their client states, or whatever you want to call them, in Eastern Europe, they created what were nicknamed by Westerners Little Stalins, and they would promote a leader. They did that even Mongolia. It was Choibalsan. He was this a Stalin-like cult of the great leader of Mongolia, Choibalsan, and this was done in Eastern Europe. So this was just part of Soviet policy, and it was actually the Soviet. It was a deliberate policy when they selected him, chose him as the leader. A selection process which is not fully documented or understood. Andrei Longkov has written the most about this, and he's looked into the Russian archives, but it doesn't, you know, it does seem to have been, well, we have to find somebody, but this guy seems okay. And that was already there. Even before he came to power in 1948, there was already a song that was played called the Song of General Kim Il-sung, which is still played. It's still broadcast. It played at important occasions in North Korea. That was written at this time. It was written by a North Korean composer, but at the advice, direction of the Soviet advisors. So that there was already this Stalinist cult. And what happened is it sort of later took on elements, and I would say some of those elements are clearly from Imperial Japan. For just to give one example without giving too much detail in it, in Japan, people kept portraits of the emperor, and in schools, right? They would be kept in a kind of, you know, they would be kept in a special place, and there was these ceremonies at the beginning of the school day in which students would line up. They would read the imperial script on education, but by the Meiji Emperor, and they would all bow in the direction of Tokyo. Even in Korea, they did this. I mean, this is what Koreans grew up in. this cult of the mystical cult of the emperor. And many of these same elements are still there today. North Korea, the North Koreans, students, they line up and they have a ceremony and they bow before the portrait of Kim Il-sung. And often, if you want to know where the placement for what we could call shrines to the great leader are often places that were shrines to the Japanese emperor. They were located in the same spot. I think really the question is, considering that Koreans knew nothing else in their history but a sort of cult of the leader, whether it was the king, the Japanese emperor. What's interesting is why South Koreans didn't evolve this way. I mean, I think that there's the question is, why wasn't there a cult of Park Chung-hee? Why weren't there statues of him? Why weren't people bowing before him? That's the interesting thing. That would be the question that I would ask. Why that did not happen in the South.
I'm going to call on Alejandra. She's had her hand up waiting. Go ahead, Alejandra.
Oh, hi. Sorry. I have a question. Do you think North Korea and South Korea will ever be unified again?
Could you say that again? I couldn't hear you.
Oh, yeah. Oh, sorry. I don't know if my microphone is working. Is it working?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, okay. By the way, I'm sorry for the correction. Yes, there were, but there was not and sure, the portrait of, by the way, I'm just responding to this comment. Of course, there was the portrait of Park Chung-hee was found in every public place and office, but there was not anything like the personality cult or even the mystical elements of it that you had in North Korea. But yes, that's a good point brought up. I'm sorry, Alejandra.
Okay, Alejandra, go ahead, try that again.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay.
I'm very
Do
sorry.
you think North Korea and South Korea will be unified again?
Do I think they'll be unified? I don't know. Obviously, historians are notoriously bad at predicting the future. Right? That's why we're all poor. Otherwise, we'd all be, we'd all know how to invest in the stock market and get super rich. So I don't really want to make a speculation. Alejandro, just to give you an example of how hard it is to predict. If you go back, the Soviet Union disintegrated in 1991 and became 15 different republics, and with Russia basically a smaller version of what was the old Russia before the revolution. You can read what historians and political scientists and say, right? And you go right up in 1991 and almost none predicted that, right? I mean, right? None predicted it. And I'll give you another example. In 1989, I had a friend. I was in Hawaii at the time, and I had a friend who was French, taught French at the University of Hawaii, and he told me that he said before I left Hawaii, before I finished my PhD, the Berlin Wall would go down. He said it's going to be gone. And I actually made a bet with him that, okay, we'll see in 2 years if that's still there. Well, it went down a week later. I lost my bet in 1 week. But it went down, it was gone by November 11th. And this was the beginning of November of 1989. And I made a bet in 2 years it'd still be there. So I just want to point out the future is extremely hard to predict. There are just so many contingencies that go on. So it's very possible that 10 years from now, Korea will be unified and there'll be no North Korea at all, no Democratic People's Republic. And it's possible by the time you're in your celebrate your 100th birthday, it'll still be there. Or it's possible that by the time you're old, China, the North Korea will be part of China. It'll be the autonomous, whatever you want to call it, the Chosun Autonomous Region of China or something. We just don't know. Okay.
Yeah.
Uh,
Let me
Fine.
get a question from Faizan.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Alejandra. Faizan, go ahead with your question.
Yes, I would like to ask that during the 1990s famine in North Korea, how much heavily dependent was North Korea on China? How much did China help the North Korea during all this time? I just wanted to ask this.
That's a good question, and the answer is not much. Most China did not provide a lot of economic aid to North Korea, and North Korea did ask, but it never got much from China. It's not that it got nothing, but it was mainly dependent on the Soviet Union. And do remember that, just to make sense of this, in 1970s and 80s, the Soviet Union devoted a lot of resources to its allies and client states. It subsidized Cuba. It subsidized the regime in Ethiopia for a while, with the Somalia before that, and then Ethiopia when they switched sides in '74. It was subsidizing, Vietnam, subsidies to Nicaragua, to Angola. I mean, the Soviet Union, and Gorbachev actually wanted to cut back on this. This is the Soviet Union was spending a lot of its modest resources on helping its clients, and North Korea was one of those. And Soviet Union and aid to North Korea was quite generous, and there was nothing equivalent to that of the Chinese. No.
Okay, thank you. Let me go to our chat box for a minute. How have South Korean attitudes toward North Korea changed over time?
Attitudes of North Korea towards South Korea?
The other way around. Korea
attitudes of
North.
South Korea towards North Korea have changed.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Well, some of you are in a better position living in Korea to know this than I do. But what's the thing that really surprised me is that I was asked to give a couple of talks to some Yonsei international program or something at Yonsei. There was mostly fluent English speakers, Korean students, and there were some graduate course, and I don't remember the name of the course. And I was kind of shocked because I remember when I was in Korea some 30 years earlier, the students were saying things like they weren't even opposed. Some of them were opposed to unification, at least right away. And I remember one student saying to me that those people are all brain damaged, and they're kind of like useless people. What are we going to do with them? And that was that was a real shock to me to hear these very bright, young South Koreans saying something like that, something I would have never heard of when I lived in Korea, even, because conversations were more constrained, but no. So I don't know. It does seem to have changed. Of course, I think all Koreans still see themselves as one Korea, one nation. But I do think the Koreans have changed. Of course, that started even with the unification of Germany, and people saw the costs and difficulties of that. And we also know that the prejudice in South Korea towards North Korea. And so I guess what it was is that when when I lived in South Korea, all South Koreans wanted unification, and they wanted it now, as soon as possible, at any cost. And I don't think that's true anymore. The unification, maybe someday.
Here's another question from the chat box. At what point in the past were North and South Korea the closest at possible reunification, or at least stronger relations?
That is a really good question. And my opinion of that judgment of that has changed. One point, other than during the Korean War, one could say the closest they came towards unification would have been about the 27th or 28th of June in 1950. But after that, there was a period in around 1972 when there were talks and that. But I'm not sure they were really close. I think this was a tactical move on the part of North Korea, but they seemed closer at that point than almost any other point in their history when they issued the joint communique in July of 1972 and talked about laid out a program for eventual unification. At least it had the appearance they were closer than any other time.
Okay, Kim Jong-sung, please ask your question.
Hi, this is Jong-sung Kim. My question is that what is your understanding why North Korea wants to become or already had become a nuclear power?
Well, it's obvious. I mean, it's the obvious benefits are great, and first of all, North Korea always wanted to develop a strong military, and they were always interested in the nuclear program. So was South Korea. Yeah, both South Korea and North Korea had a clandestine nuclear program in the 1970s. So you probably know Park Chung-hee would want to develop nuclear weapons, but basically the United States stopped him. It would give the country leverage in any kind of negotiation but later, the weapons served several purposes. For one thing, it was an insurance against a preemptive strike or an invasion by the United States and South Korea, especially when the country became weakened. Certainly by the 1990s, North Korea could not match South Korea militarily because South Korea had better weapons, right? A stronger economy. I mean, if it was a conventional war, South Korea would have won probably on its own in North Korea. And North Korea was in pretty bad shape in the 1990s. Many of its soldiers were undernourished. They lowered the standard height of a military service people. A lot of their vehicles were idle because there was no petroleum, or when they were running, they were being used for commercial purposes. I think that 1990s was pretty obvious that North Korea was no match, and even in a conventional war with South Korea, and especially with the South Korea and the United States. So North Korea, by having nuclear weapons, this would be a way of protecting itself. And especially after the US invasion of Iraq, I mean, North Koreans came to the conclusion, which I would share, that if Saddam Hussein had nuclear bombing, he'd still be in power. So it was, but it also served a couple other purposes. And one was to a visible demonstration to its own people that it was making progress at a time when they couldn't. It was obvious that it was not making a lot of economic progress, but at least they were becoming militarily strong. And it was an impressive, they can impress people, but look what we have, we're a nuclear power now. And it may have served, and this is pure speculation, but it's my belief that it also served as an insurance policy against China.
Okay, thank you. RJ Banta, please come ahead with your question.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. I think I've already written my question in the chat box, but let me read it for you. So apart from China, Japan, Russia, and the US, did other neighboring countries, particularly Southeast Asian countries, contribute to the development or failure of North and South Korea economically or otherwise, or perhaps politically or diplomatically?
Could you repeat the last part of your question? I had trouble understanding. It kind of
yes,
faded out a little bit.
Yes, so let me just read it again. It's available in the chat box. So apart from China, Japan, Russia, and the US, other neighboring countries, particularly Southeast Asian countries, contribute to the development or failure of North and South Korea, economically or otherwise, or perhaps politically or diplomatically? I mean, I think everyone knows that the East Asian Summit that is being hosted by the ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is being used to convene both North and South Korea to talk about reunification. That's
North,
only
South, and Korea
for,
did what?
the
I'm
recent-
sorry. You're breaking up on me. North and South Korea did what?
Yes. That North and South Korea utilized the East Asian Summit to discuss about reunification and other matters, which is
Right.
hosted by the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. But that's only during recent years. So I was wondering throughout your research if Southeast Asian countries contribute to the development or failure of North and South Korea.
I don't know if South Asia, in the sense of the Indian subcontinent, but there were, North Korea did have very good relations with Southeast Asian countries. It had good relations with Indonesia for a while, right? Indonesia was the first place in Asia that Kim Il-sung ever visited was Indonesia. He was there in 1965. And if you look at North Korean propaganda pictures, you can see a lot of pictures of him and Sukarno together for a while. North Korea had very close relations with Cambodian government of Prince Sihanouk. In fact, Prince Sihanouk had a house in Pyongyang where he spent part of his time. And they also had good relations with Burma, as it was called then, until of course, October 9th, 1983, when they tried to blow up Chengdu-Huan. I would say that, so I think that Southeast Asian countries, some Southeast Asian countries, the ones that were not tied to US alliance, like Thailand or the Philippines, were supportive of North Korea. I mean, Vietnam, Cambodia, Burma, Malaysia, these were reliable countries during most of the years in the 60s and 70s and into early 80s would support North Korea diplomatically. The economic relations between those countries and North Korea were minimal. But they had good relations. But these things all began to sour, right? The Suharto regime, became was too anti-communist, and their influence, and Burma turned against them after 1983. So the influence in connection to North Korea. South Korea, of course, was just the opposite. As North Korea's influence in Southeast Asia diminished, South Korea's influence became greater. As far as were you interested in India as well? Because I really couldn't tell you too much, because I don't think either North or South Korea, to my knowledge, really had close involvement with India. And remember, South Korea's interests also were economic, and India was not until the 90s. India was really not very open to international trade.
Actually, the reasoning behind my question is when we talk about the history of North and South Korea, it's always about the neighboring countries of China, Japan, and the US and Russia. But I was wondering if other countries have any significant contribution or influence to the development or failure of the countries.
I think other Asian countries' contribution or role that they played in the North and South was fairly minimal, right? And I'm not saying there was no role at all. Obviously, the Thai troops fought and Philippine troops fought in the Korean War. But I would say that their involvement, the connection between the Korean Peninsula and South or Southeast Asia was very modest, okay, during this time.
Okay, thank you.
Um,
Michael, in regards to North Korea, how transparent do you suppose the government is with information? How much do you feel is fabricated in just to maintain an appearance of strength or success?
Well, North, a lot of it's fabricated, of course. The statistics, for example, have to be treated treated with great caution, and this has always been true. In fact, North Korea either did not publish reliable statistics at all. I mean, when I was looking at things in North Korea, they would publish like you know, whatever it was. Steel production was up 18%, but 18% from what? Just to give you an idea, the third 7-year plan, or second 7-year plan in the 1970s listed production goals. It was announced in 1975 that these goals were supposed to be completed in 1978, but it was announced in 1975 that the goals had been completed ahead of schedule and met. But when the next 7-year plan was issued, the production goals were almost exactly the same as the previous 7-year plan. The 1978 through 1984 economic development plan listed almost identical goals to the previous 1972 to 78 development plan. So you read something like that and you realize, well, these numbers and statistics mean nothing, right? So, and I think that hasn't really changed very much. If you're talking about just statistical information, if you're discussing North Korea's, the narrative, the story they tell their people, of course, that has only the most tenuous connection with reality.
Another question from the chat box. When the DPRK was experiencing its worst in the 90s, China was experiencing a high-speed growth period.
Yeah.
Why didn't they help North Korea?
That's interesting. The 1990s, China and North Korea did not have particularly good relations. There was the number of exchange between North Korean officials and Chinese officials were few and far between. China, yeah, we could say the relations between China and North Korea in the 90s, for most of the 90s, were fairly frosty. The Chinese made an attempt to try to persuade the North Koreans. Almost every time the North Koreans would visit China, they would be taken to a special economic zone or shown a farm that had been essentially privatized, and but North Koreans did not listen. In fact, their relations were just not good. They only improved a little bit around 2001, 2002. There was some improvement in relations, but they were not too good. Yeah. It's amazing how isolated North Korea actually was diplomatically and politically in the 90s.
The other day, Kim Jong-un seemed to show a kind of honesty on the bad economic situation in the country. What do you think the reason was for his honesty, and what kind of impact would that have on North Korea?
In January 1st, 1994, just a few months before his death, Kim Il-sung gave what turned out to be his last annual New Year's message. And in it, for the first time in the history of North Korea, in the 46 6 years of the regime. He admitted that to economic problems, that the country was in having serious economic difficulties, that it had failed to meet its economic goals in the previous economic plan. And people were, foreign observers were kind of shocked by this because North Korea never made anything like this. And it was thought by some this was a prelude that North Korea was going to move into a kind of Chinese-style reforms. Things are not working, but it didn't. And there have been several times since then the North Korean leaders came out and said, things are not going out well. And each time there's been this hope that this would signal a major change in economic policy or in international policy, that North Korea would try to open up and liberalize its economy. So I don't know what to make of this. I can only say that if we go by past experiences, it may signify a change or it may not.
John Jackson, are you still with us? You have a question. Go ahead and unmute your mic and ask away, please.
Yes, I am. I didn't see how to wave, and
That's all right. We got you.
that's what I was doing on my phone,
Oh.
trying to find out how to wave on Zoom. But I have a question. What most interested me was the fact that Kim Il-sung used Confucianism and his respect for the family initially to, it seems, gain control. My understanding of Confucianism is that Confucius, his teachings worked with on a hierarchy. There are two different forces that come together. One is the self-assertive, which could be maybe individualism, and the other was the self-transcending. And it seems that he used the self-transcending in a way to promote.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that last comment.
Kim Il-sung used the self-transcending tendency in Confucianism to gain control and promote himself and his family. And, after Confucius's teachings, the Han Dynasty did the same thing. They took the self-transcending aspect of Confucius's teachings and used it as a means to control the populace. Now, I see this happening in South Korea. I've lived here a long time and I've seen it, and rather disturbs me. But in South Korea, the self-transcending has been used to suppress individualism. And I was interested when you mentioned that it seems that Kim Il-sung used the same sort of, I don't know if it was, well, in North Korea, I think it was intentional. In South Korea, I don't know if it was that intentionally planned on a governmental level, but in society, I see it everywhere. And perhaps one reason that South Korea was able to advance as it has, as compared with North Korea, is the fact that the idea of individualism and the self-assertive tendency found a root here, perhaps because of the influence of America and Western culture, which North Korea did not have as much of. So I don't know where this question is going, but this has always been interesting to me, this self-assertive tendency and this self-transcending tendency. And in America, now, the self-assertive tendency seems to be out of control. Whereas in Korea, the self-transcending tendency seems to be working quite well as regards the pandemic. So in the future, I'm just wondering how this would play out in North Korea. It seems they have used the self-transcending tendency to promote an elite. But on the other hand, they've certainly demonstrated that they have the power to become a self-assertive entity amongst nations by developing a nuclear weapon, considering what they had to work with. So I don't know if I have a question, but I'm just tossing this out. It's what interests me about North Korea, South Korea.
Well, it's okay. We have an answer there. I would agree with this comment about you would see that in the marketplace. Yeah, I'm not sure really how to answer that. I think it's an interesting observation. Of course, every culture is influenced by its cultural heritage, and Confucianism and all the values, excuse me, that were associated with it was so central to Korean culture that it would be surprising if it didn't influence North or South Korea. The interesting question would be, question would be, which Korea, North or South, has deviated most from this Confucian heritage? And I think you can make an argument for either one. Certainly, there was a more conscious rejection initially of its Confucian heritage and values in North Korea than South Korea. But on the other hand, as you pointed out, South Korea has been a far more open society. In some ways, North Korea is kind of a fossilized state. It hasn't been so open, and its influences are the traditional Confucian mixed with the strong impact of Imperial Japan, which of course was also Confucianist, and Marxism, which had a big impact on thinking. And I would say that Marxism was profoundly influenced by Christianity. Therefore, you see a link there. South Korea has been much more open international society that it is that I think it has become. I'm not saying any less Confucianist, but I do think I think it's more complicated than North Korea, South Korea, because it is just such a much more open society and subject to so many influences. But it's certainly South Korea is definitely much more westernized and much more profoundly influenced by Western culture, by Christianity, by the United States. But I just don't know where it's going. It's a very interesting point. It's probably another discussion, topic for another discussion.
I'm going to move us to a question of practical matters in dealing with writing history. Doing the history of North Korea must be challenging in terms of acquiring reliable sources. As a historian, what kind of sources did you consult? And do you have any tips on reading North Korean sources for someone else who might want to study?
Yeah, I relied on all the published works available in English on North Korea. That's a good starting point. And then I read a lot of the South Korean stuff that hasn't been translated, which was, some of it was very insightful. In fact, it bothers me that there's so much good stuff, material available in Korean that should be translated, and a lot of good scholarship done by South Koreans. So I rely mainly on secondary literature rather than the first. But I did read the propaganda, and because you really don't have a whole lot in the way of primary sources for North Korea being such a closed society. But here is one thing that I would suggest that people want to understand North Korea. Read what they say, and don't be put off by the obvious propaganda elements, and don't be put off by the fact that so much of North Korean public material is so badly written, so repetitive, and it's almost can be mind-numbing. But just try to figure out what is the story that they're telling their own people, and try to read from there. I think a lot of there's an interesting book that's recently come out, and I'm going to I just read. I just reviewed it. Now I'm suddenly blanking out, and it's a looking at the life of factory workers in North Korea in the late 50s and early 60s, and it uses almost all just official published North Korean sources, and yet the author is able to squeeze an awful lot of information by reading them carefully. So don't dismiss, read what the North Koreans are saying. That would be my advice.
Thank you. Lots of observations, lots of questions in the chat box that unfortunately we just don't have time to get through all of it. Some of the questions that we didn't specifically deal with, if you wrote a question, I think Dr. Seth touched on those through some other questions, but our time has gone quickly tonight, and it's time for us to close. I want to thank you all for joining us and for sharing in a very interesting conversation. Our next lecture will be Tuesday, January 26th at 7:30 p.m. Join us by Zoom for a lecture by Professor George Callender from Syracuse University in New York. Dr. Callender has recently published the first English language translation of a Korean literature classic. In 1636, the Manchu forces, which later became the Qing dynasty, invaded Chosun, forcing the king and his court to flee to Namhan Sansang, southeast of Seoul. Callender's translation of Government Minister Naman Gop's personal diary of those dangerous years gives unusually intimate insight into the inner workings of the Chosun royal court, with personal reflections on the actions of the king and many of the government officials. We look forward to seeing you then. Good night. And Dr. Seth, good morning to you.
And I want to thank everybody for the wonderful questions. I was very impressed by both the quality and quantity of the questions. And thanks everyone. Bye.